All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are featuring a new book by David Greenberg of Rutgers University entitled John Lewis, A Life, published earlier this year, or this month, by Simon & Schuster. Our discussants this afternoon are Tracy Parker of the University of California, Davis, and Brett Gadsden of Northwestern University. I'm Sarah Weichsel. I'm the Director of Research and Publications at the American Historical Association, and I am co-chairing today's session with Eric Arneson of George Washington University. As many of you know, the seminar, launched in 2010, has been a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. Since the summer of 2020, we've been assembling participants from across the country and the globe here in this online format. So today's session is sponsored by the American Historical Association, given this book's focus on domestic history and politics. I want to outline a few quick things before we get going. First, as always, we like to recognize a key figure whose behind-the-scenes labors make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Second, please take note, the next session of the Washington History Seminar will take place on Monday, November 4th at 4 p.m. when we discuss James Graham Wilson's America's Cold Warrior, Paul Nietzsche, and National Security from Roosevelt to Reagan. We hope you can join us. Please mark your calendars. Third, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on the Washington History Seminar's YouTube page, where many dozens of our past programs are archived. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we'd ask that those with questions use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We will call on as many folks as possible. And now I'll turn it over to Eric Arneson to introduce our speakers and to moderate the event. Eric?
Thank you, Sarah. It's my pleasure to introduce our author this afternoon, David Greenberg, Professor of History and Journalism and Media Studies, works at Rutgers University, where he writes about history, politics, and media for a variety of scholarly and popular publications. He's the author of the award-winning Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency, published by Norton in 2016, Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, Norton 2003, and Calvage Coolidge, published by Henry Holt, 2006. He's also the author of Alan Brinkley, A Life in History, at Columbia University Press, published in 2018. He's a frequent contributor in the national news media on contemporary politics and public affairs, and has written for the Washington Post, Politico, Slate, the New York Times, and the New Republic. He is no stranger to the Washington History Seminar, having served as a discussant in a past session. Today, he is speaking on his new book, John Lewis, A Life. David, welcome back to the seminar.
Thank you, Eric. Good to be with you. And thank you to you and Sarah, to the AHA, to the Wilson Center, and also in advance to Brett and Tracy for what I'm sure will be an excellent exchange. A biography is not the kind of book that lends itself easy to encapsulation. It's not necessarily argument driven. It's not easily compressed, because the whole point is one wants to take in the person in full, the life in full. But let me do my best to at least give you a sense of why I thought John Lewis's life was worthy of biography. It's an interesting fact that when I started this book in 2019, there was no biography of John Lewis. It may seem surprising that someone who had risen to such stature and celebrity, even in our public life, lacked a proper biography. But lo and behold, I discovered that one day in the middle of the Trump presidency that he had no such proper treatment. And so I took it upon myself to try to do my best to do justice to his very event-filled and history-making life. I think people know the bare facts about John Lewis, but even when you first start to look into his childhood, you find surprises. I begin the book talking about how much of a voracious reader John Lewis was as a child. He was born into really quite abject poverty in rural Alabama, in Pike County outside of Troy. And I found oral histories with his father and his mother who said that he had 9 siblings. They would be out playing, and he would have his nose in a book in a corner inside somewhere. At first, it was the Bible, and that attachment to the Bible and to Christianity stayed with him and was a kind of guiding lodestar his whole life and career. But he also became interested in poetry and biography and history. And it's actually kind of an interesting dimension of John Lewis, this intellectual side. Later he did not 1 but 2 undergraduate degrees, one at the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, and then I think in part because he had been caught up in the Nashville movement and wanted to remain there, did a 2nd degree at Fisk, where he studied religion and philosophy. So there's a real intellectual curiosity to John Lewis that I think marked him sort of from the beginning as, a little bit of an odd bird in his family, a little bit different. He was also the one who really not only felt the sting of Jim Crow, segregation, of this oppressive society in which all African Americans lived, but who from an early age resolved that he wanted to do something to bring down those walls of segregation. He would go to the drugstore for an ice cream, and the white kids could eat their ice cream inside, and he and his siblings had to have their ice creams outside the store. At the movie theater, the Black kids had to sit up in the balcony, not in the main seating area, which was reserved for whites. At one point, when he's denied a library card simply on account of the color of his skin, he tries to organize a petition. So you see this instinct for protest even very early. But what really turns him on, I think, to the life of protest is following the movement, which, he's born in 1940. So as a young teenager, he's very much aware of the lynching of Emmett Till, thinks this is a boy my own age, could have been me. He's very much aware of Martin Luther King, who he hears over the radio and who inspires him to go into the ministry and try to follow in King's footsteps. And indeed, when he gets to Nashville, it's really, I don't think it's too bold a claim to say that he's really only second to King in his centrality to so many of the key moments of that window, say from 1960 to 1965. If you think about it, John Lewis is a leader in the Nashville movement, which of all the student sit-in movements of 1960 achieves the most rapid and dramatic gains. The next year, he is one of the original Freedom Riders and also one of the Nashville group who, after the Freedom Rides are discontinued, and people may know that one of the buses is firebombed in Anniston, the other one has its riders attacked to the point where James Farmer is ready to call off the Freedom Rides. It's John Lewis and the Nashville group who insist, no, it must continue, and who lead the continuation of those Freedom Rides, ultimately to success with the desegregation of interstate travel. He's a figure at the March on Washington, recently chosen as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and speaks to 250,000 assembled in what is seen as the most defiant and controversial speech of the day. He's there in Mississippi Freedom Summer, 1964, and the Atlantic City contest, trying to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that August at the Democratic Convention. And then, of course, people are familiar with his heroism at Selma in 1965 in the fight for voting rights, where his peaceful confrontation with state troopers leads to him and others being beaten, in Lewis's case, almost to death by but where his beating and his victimization helps mobilize public opinion and political opinion to pass some months later the Voting Rights Act. So in that very short time span, you see John Lewis, a very young man engaged at the center of all these critical events. It might seem a little bit odd that John Lewis would assume this leadership role, because after all, and he was like this even late in life, he was something of a shy man, very self-effacing. He was never the first one to speak his mind in a discussion. He sort of kept his counsel and only spoke when he felt he really had something to say. Not necessarily the kind of natural-born leader, at least by our sort of traditional understandings. And over time, I came to see two things about John Lewis. One, he was not without ambition, and that he did feel a calling to leadership. It wasn't necessarily the brash elbow your way to the front kind, but he had deep convictions and instincts that he felt important. We were important to share, and important to share with the movement in the form of leadership. His friends and colleagues also saw in him, I think, an uncommon, almost unique, maybe not completely unique, devotion to the principles of Gandhian nonviolence. And by this, I mean, many people in the movement embraced nonviolence as a tactic, as a method, precisely to win over public opinion. You knew that it might not be natural if somebody slugged you while you were sitting on a bar stool, a lunch counter stool, not to hit back. But you learned that if you didn't hit back and you took the abuse, that either there in the moment or over time, opinion would swing your way, and that the injustice of the system that they wanted to expose would be revealed to the wider community, to the nation, indeed to the world. But John Lewis saw this not only as a tactic, and I think, again, he was rare in this regard, but in feeling it to the depth of his being. James Lawson, who was one of the ministers who trained this group in Nashville, he was just a divinity student at Vanderbilt at the time. I had the privilege to interview him. He passed away last summer at 94. But he told me that when John Lewis got to Nashville, he was already ripe for these teachings in nonviolence. He hadn't read Gandhi. It was many of the readings and ideas were in that sense new to him, but he felt a kind of instant and intrinsic connection. And I think he carried that with him to his last days. He really believed in nonviolence, as he always said, as a philosophy and a way of life, not simply as a tactic. One kind of touching incident in the book comes when Martin Luther King is in Selma for the first time, sort of trying to restart the voting rights campaign there. And after checking into his hotel, a formerly segregated hotel that as a result of the 64 Act had just been desegregated, King is sucker punched by a white segregationist who's there in the lobby. And John Lewis instinctively grabs the guy in a bear hug before the police can take him away. And Lewis berates himself because in that bear hug, he violates the tenets of nonviolence, which of course, bid him to not use physical force in any circumstance, and that it would have been better perhaps for this man to be exposed without John Lewis's intervention. But we can forgive him some kind of human slip-ups. So I really tell the full story, and some of these stories I think and hope I am able to get into in a depth that may not be there in some of the other wonderful accounts we have of SNCC or of the civil rights movement, because I'm really focusing on Lewis's story, the controversy over his speech at the March on Washington, for example. Or I think even more revealing may be the account I have of the Nashville years, People know about the 1960 lunch counter desegregation, but they may not know about the next 3 years when John Lewis, with a much smaller group, kind of fights week in, week out to desegregate the many, many other eating establishments and hotels and swimming pools and so forth that remain segregated even after that famous 1960 victory. And then, of course, there's the story of his conflicts within SNCC. And I have a very full account of how in 1966, after 3 years chairing SNCC, he feels his support drifting away. We're now at a moment where the Civil Rights Act has been passed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been passed. And the civil rights movement and SNCC in particular are at a crossroads. What's the proper direction? What are the next great fights to be fought? There's a lot of division. And it's also at a time where the movement is radicalizing, America is radicalizing, and many in SNCC are going in the direction of what comes to be called Black Power. And there is rather less tolerance or interest in the kind of resolutely integrated movement that John Lewis had overseen in Nashville and that he deeply believed in. Rather less interest or tolerance for nonviolence, which many people who had seen it tactically felt had run its course. And Lewis manages, partly because there's such great affection and loyalty to him, to hold on to his chairmanship that night. But then late at night, a former member of SNCC, someone who's actually no longer really in the organization, comes into the retreat that they're having at a place called Kingston Springs, a church retreat outside of Nashville, challenges the election and says, what have you guys done in reelecting John Lewis? This proceeds to open up a whole conversation. A welter of grievances toward Lewis come pouring forth. He's too ready to work with politicians. He's too ready to kiss up to Martin Luther King and will never say a bad word about King, something that was in fact true. He idolized King all the while. He was too churchy. The movement was going in a more secular, militant direction. And at the end of the night, on rather dubious grounds, a second election is called. John Lewis is deposed, as it were, and Stokely Carmichael comes in for the next year as SNCC chairman. This leads eventually to Lewis's departure from SNCC, but it opens up a whole second act. F. Scott Fitzgerald said there are no second acts in American life, and Lewis really defies that prophecy. He has a magnificent second act going from protest to politics. And I take that phrase, as Brett knows, it's one we've talked about a lot, from Bayard Rustin, who right around the time that Black Power is coming into vogue, articulates an alternate vision for the future of the movement, which is to go into elective politics and to seize power that way. Not solely on the strength of Black votes, though Black votes will be an important part of that power, but in coalition with, as Rustin liked to say, the coalition that formed the March on Washington, with Jewish groups, Catholic groups, labor groups, other progressive groups. And I think also in the book, I show a kind of relationship between Rustin and Lewis, a mentorship there that maybe hasn't been sufficiently appreciated until now. And that political sense that marked Bayard Rustin and sort of his late career goes on to characterize John Lewis and his second act. In 1968, he enters politics in a big way by working for Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. He's with Kennedy in Indianapolis on April 4th, on the terrible night where Martin Luther King is killed. And then, sort of amazingly, he's with Bobby Kennedy, or he's just upstairs in the Ambassador Hotel the night that he is assassinated just 2 months later. This brings John Lewis probably to the lowest moment of his life. He's alienated from the movement that had meant everything to him for all of his young life. His great hero, Martin Luther King, has been killed. the man onto whom he had sort of transferred his affections and also his hopes in Bobby Kennedy has now been killed. And he's actually hospitalized for depression. I think they call it exhaustion, but it seems to have been depression. He's just started dating a woman named Lillian Miles. And Lillian comes to visit him each day in the hospital. She brings him his mail. She brings him his newspaper. He remains an avid reader, especially of the news. And very unromantically, he proposes to her from his hospital bed. At this point, he's 28, has never really had a serious relationship, but decides Lillian is the one for him. And one of his good friends, a Georgia congressman named Buddy Darden, who came a white congressman from an adjacent district, said to me, "You can't understand the second act of John Lewis without understanding the role of Lillian Miles. She put the steel in his spine. She encouraged his ambitions, gave him the confidence to run." And although I don't have time now to get into all of it, and perhaps in the Q&A we can discuss some of it, I do think one contribution of this book is to sort of map out that whole second act, because besides having made history in the arts of protest, he also turned out to be a very good and effective politician. And the second half of the book traces his years of the voter education project in the 70s, getting millions of Blacks across the South to register. His days in the Carter administration, little known and not fully appreciated. His years on the Atlanta City Council, and then 34 years in Congress, and his relationships with presidents, from Bill Clinton to Obama to Donald Trump, but also with key figures in the Democratic Party leadership, starting with Tom Foley, the Speaker of the House in the late 80s, early 90s, through Nancy Pelosi. And I think as we see John Lewis as an effective figure in the Congress, he of course becomes known as the conscience of the Congress, we start to see how by the end he has actually fused protest and politics into something that is singularly John Lewis. And so I'll conclude my opening remarks here, but I hope questioners and audiences will think about the interplay of protest and politics, both in John Lewis's life and career, and also in the way that we all think about bringing about social and political change. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Before we move on to our discussants, I want to simply remind folks in the audience that you can participate through the questions that you pose. You can do so in two ways. You can use the raise hand function, our preferred method. In that case, you unmute yourself, we call on you, and you pose the question in your own voice, or you can use the Q&A function in Zoom, in which case you write out your question and I get to read it. You can get in the queue at any point. Our first discussant this afternoon is Tracy Parker, Associate Professor at the University of California, Davis. She focuses on civil rights and the Black Power movements, labor, consumer capitalism, gender, and sexuality. She is the author of Department Stores in the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and Civil Rights from the 1930s to the 1980s, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2019, and she's the co-editor of the New Civil Rights Movement Reader, Resistance, Resilience, and Justice, published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2023. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Women's History and the American Historian, and her current book project is entitled Beyond Loving, Love, Sex, and Marriage in the Black Freedom Movement. Tracy, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you, Eric. David, I was so thrilled to read this book. We met about a year and a half ago, I believe now, right? And we've been talking about this book and all the interviews you did, and it was such a pleasure to read it and see it all come together. So thank you very much. I want to start with a little bit about just an overview a bit about the book, although you've given a fantastic one so far. Greenberg's biography of John Lewis offers an unflinching, multidimensional portrait of an American icon. It shed light on his triumph and sacrifices, personal struggles, and complexities that shaped his life, drawing from more than 275 interviews, which I'm still in awe about, With those who knew him across every stage of his life and newly discovered FBI files and documents, Greenberg does much more than celebrate and honor Lewis. He invites readers to grapple with the personal costs of spending a lifetime spent fighting for justice. Lewis is revealed as both a remarkable leader and a profoundly vulnerable individual. Lewis's journey began as a poor boy from Troy, Alabama. I think that's what King and Abernathy would call him, if I remember correctly, where his early devotion to God saw him ministering to chickens before eventually turning to people. Inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who provided him, quote, a model of how he might spend his life, end quote, Lewis transformed into a leading figure of the civil rights movement. Lewis's ambition was rooted in the emotional power of the Black church as he sought to harness that energy to dismantle racial segregation and discrimination. His steadfast commitment to nonviolence led him through pivotal battles from the Nashville sit-in movement, which resulted in the Southern city becoming the first major city in the South to allow Blacks and whites to eat together in public spaces, to the Freedom Rides, which without Lewis may have ended before it met its goal. Lewis was the youngest speaker at the 1963 March on Washington, and under his visionary leadership, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee became a driving force for change. Greenberg masterfully reveals the toll that relentless activism exacted on Lewis. In 1962, Lewis wrote to SNCC's James Foreman, admitting burnout, mental strain, and exhaustion. Quote, "The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Despite these struggles, Lewis never retreated. In 1964, his intense pace, over 100,000 miles of travel in a year and a half without an assistant, worried colleagues, and he was urged to rest. The repeated beatings in 1961, for example, he was beaten by a mob during the Freedom Rides, but most notably, his 1965 beating at the hands of Alabama state troopers at the foot of Edmund Pettus Bridge, and Selma, where he nearly lost his life, but inspired a nation. All of this eventually took a toll on John, leading to some memory loss. This lasting physical damage reminded me of King, who, after being stabbed in the chest with a letter opener by Isola Ware Curry during a book signing in Harlem in 1958, endured a minor breathing issue for the rest of his life. Lewis is also afflicted with profound loneliness and episodes of depression, dismay, and disillusionment, which once again had me reflecting on his mentor, Dr. King, who experienced multiple periods of severe depression and on at least one occasion contemplated suicide. King was hospitalized several times for exhaustion. Greenberg describes a moment when the emotional weight of the fight of racial justice took a physical toll on Lewis. In 1968, in the aftermath of the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy, Lewis was hospitalized for exhaustion and what friends believed to be clinical depression. The years of burnout and mental and physical strain had finally caught up to Lewis. I want to note that Lewis and King weren't the only ones to suffer a price for their activism. Fannie Lou Hamer, the 1960s voting rights activist who famously declared at the age of 46, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," passed away at the age of 59 due to breast cancer and complications from hypertension. And Erica Gardner, a member of the Black Lives Matter movement, died at 27, just 3.5 years after her father, Eric Gardner. She passed away 4 months after the birth of her second child. Her difficulty breathing due to asthma led to a major heart attack that ultimately claimed her life. In the weeks before her death, she spoke of the stress, exhaustion, and frustration she experienced as a spokesperson for BLM. Lewis's dedication came at the expense of his personal relationships as well, and this may have partly been due to a conscious decision to prioritize the cause over everything else. This left him, quote, "married to the movement," as Greenberg writes, and often alone. This doesn't seem to be quite uncommon for many activists in the civil rights and Black Power movements. But John doesn't remain alone for long, however. Greenberg noted earlier in the book that Lewis never seemed particularly interested in romantic pursuits, often struggling with relationships. His account of reporting on his seminary classmates for chasing women is both amusing and revealing. While he appears to have dated a woman named Liz, who, if I remember correctly, participated in the Nashville movement as a young activist, little detail is provided about this relationship. We get more insight into his personal life through his relationship with Lillian Miles. In 1969, Zernona Clayton, a journalist and Southern Christian Leadership Conference officer, took on the role of matchmaker. She invited Lewis to a New Year's Eve dinner where she set him up with Lillian Miles, a librarian at Atlanta University. Greenberg writes, quote, Lillian was highly cultured, an avid reader, and a connoisseur of art. She was lively and intelligent and held her own in conversation. But Lewis did not swoon. I'm not sure I have it in me, Lewis later wrote. Still, he was intrigued enough to invite Lillian to his birthday party in February, and they soon began dating. While Lewis's relationship with Lillian offered some stability, it was marked by practical demands of politics rather than romantic ideals. For example, as David mentioned earlier, while resting in Holy Family Hospital for exhaustion in 1968, Lillian visited daily, bringing his mail and the morning newspaper, a bright spot for Lewis. And in this period of vulnerability and desperation, Lewis proposed marriage. It was simple and far from romantic. Why don't we get married? Was all he uttered, and Lillian accepted. Greenberg writes, quote, no sooner was Lewis discharged, however, than romance again took a backseat to politics, end quote. Even their wedding ceremony seems more like an item to check off a to-do list than an occasion for romance and festivity. Unlike other Black middle-class weddings of the time, which were meant to signify love, prestige, and status to their families and community, the ceremony lacked these elements. Such weddings were often elaborate, reflecting young Black couples' engagement with consumerism and marking their social and economic mobility. David, I wanted to quickly ask, did you have thoughts about the wedding in particular? Did you come across people who had other thoughts about the wedding? And did you have any particular insights as to why his father didn't attend? Was it simply about he had to work? Which also then led me to think about what was his relationship with his family, but that's sort of over the long term, because to some degree, he seems a little distant from them at moments. John and Lillian's marriage, ostensibly born more of companionship than passion, provided a foundation for Lewis's political ascent and reflected the compromises necessary for someone so consumed by a larger mission. Lillian served as his political strategist, for example, encouraging him to run for Congress in 1976. She was a sounding board. She was his administrator. Lillian is portrayed not only as a fierce protector, but at times a bit of a tyrant. Though it's unclear to me how much of this characterization reflects the biases of the interviewees, who may have unintentionally reinforced stereotypes of strong Black women as bossy or overly assertive. Nevertheless, she seems good for Lewis on some level. I was also intrigued by Lewis's commitment to LGBTQ rights. Greenberg reveals that Lewis maintained friendship with Atlanta's gay community during the height of the AIDS crisis, a time when such associations were undoubtedly risky. David, you note that he was a regular at the local YMCA where he would go for massages, and that he became acquainted with a number of the city's gay leaders. He was also known to frequent gay clubs. This demonstrated certainly his deep commitment to tolerance and inclusion, but it also raises questions about the nature of his relationship with the community. These questions, in fact, nearly threatened to undermine his 1986 congressional campaign against his best friend, Julian Bond. Building on Lewis's complex alliances, I found Lewis's separation from SNCC and the end of his friendship with Julian Bond to be among the most compelling and emotionally charged parts of the book. Greenberg discusses the ideological rifts within SNCC, the political stakes of Lewis's departure from SNCC, and the profound personal and professional devastation that followed. Equally riveting is the portrayal of Lewis's deteriorating friendship with Julian Bond, two men whose lives were forged in the crucible of the civil rights movement and eventually became bitter rivals. By 1986, their relationship had become hostile as each sought the 5th District congressional seat. What had once been a partnership founded on a shared ideals transformed into a battle marked by betrayal, revealing of personal secrets, and ultimately deep animosity. Bond's cocaine addiction was exposed during the campaign, adding a painful layer to an already fraught rivalry. Greenberg's account of Lewis's breaks from SNCC and Bond are both vivid and emphatic, making the reader feel the weight of both losses in Lewis's life. These were not just political contests, they marked the end of a brotherhood that had once been central to his identity and purpose. But there are also fun moments written in the book, such as the anecdote about Bob Dylan serenading Dory Latner in Rochelle Horowitz's apartment in the days leading up to the March on Washington. These type of stories add warmth to the narrative. As a civil rights historian, I was most captivated by the first two-thirds of the book. Still, I greatly enjoyed and learned quite a bit in the latter portion, where Greenberg traces Lewis's journey beyond the civil rights movement, capturing his pivotal role in registering millions of Black voters as the head of the Voter Education Project. The book also uncovers the lesser-known story of Lewis's ascent in Atlanta politics and his distinguished career in Congress, where he was widely respected on both sides of the aisle. As a member of the Democratic leadership, he became known as the moral anchor of the legislative body, earning the title, quote, the conscience of Congress, for his relentless pursuit of justice and equality. Greenberg offers an insightful look into Lewis's post-movement career, from his stance on Jesse Jackson's 1984 presidential campaign and his opposition to Clarence Thomas's appointment to the Supreme Court, to his criticisms of the Million Man March and the personal and professional challenges he encountered during the Democratic primary between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Throughout it all, Lewis's commitment to nonviolence, inclusion, and justice remained unwavering. Greenberg's biography of Lewis is meticulously researched, demonstrating impressive breadth and depth. And so I just have a few questions that stem really from nothing that's missing in the book, but rather instead my deepening interest in Lewis. First, is there more to explore about Lewis's time with or relationship with Gloria Richardson? Second, did he ever reflect on the movement's gender dynamics? I'm thinking particularly about Casey Hayden and Mary King's position paper on sexism, or the sexism that was involved in organizing the March on Washington. Third, is there more information about the FBI's surveillance of Lewis? Did Lewis ever comment on President Lyndon B. Johnson, considering what we now know about Johnson and Hoover's efforts to undermine King and the movement? And finally, who did he turn to for companionship after Lillian passed away? Was there anyone who provided that kind of support in his final years? Again, David, thank you so much for reading this. And I will say I read this in the past couple of days, and it's a massive book, but it's a quick read. It's a really captivating and thrilling read. And so I really do, I thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. David, thoughts, responses?
Yes, no, thank you for that generous and thoughtful read and analysis, Tracy. And I'm especially happy that you picked up on some of the themes and questions that you did. In a book this size, different readers find different things, but perhaps not surprisingly, given your own work on romance and marriage and sex in the movement, those questions you raise about, for example, his wedding, are interesting ones. And I was glad you focused, found that thread of his health concerns. I mean, one point after another in the movement, he's exhausted, he's burnt out, and yet he forces himself to keep going. So anyway, to pick up on a few of these questions, well, first, although it wasn't quite a question, on the 1986 campaign, you're exactly right that in that story of his conflict with Julian Bond, these were the best of friends who ran against each other for the Democratic nomination in Atlanta's 5th District in 1986. And I won't recapitulate the whole story here. It's a chapter unto itself and almost could be a little book unto itself. But I do think John Lewis felt a repetition, echoes of 1966. I felt, he felt, damn it, they're not going to take it away from me again. Bond, just for listeners who don't know, was sort of the presumed favorite for a lot of reasons. He was just dashingly handsome and witty, but also elite Atlanta, white and black, had lined up behind him. And it's hard to remember now with John Lewis being the celebrity that he is, but Julian Bond was the big celebrity in those days. He was the one who was hosting SNL and who was doing movies with Richard Pryor. And, they were always contrasted, tall and slender and handsome and short and rumpled and speaking with this thick rural accent. Bond drove a Peugeot. John Lewis could barely drive, and when he did, drove a Chevy. So we see these contrasts all the time. And at a certain point, Lewis really felt, this other group was, including a lot of his old SNCC friends, although some were with him, were lining up with Julian, and he got fierce. And I think some of this was Lillian's encouragement too. Didn't want to let them take it from him again. The question about Gloria Richardson's a very interesting one. There probably is more to be learned. I looked a lot in the SNCC papers and the SNCC histories. In the end, the Cambridge story, the Cambridge, Maryland story, of which she's such a big part, is occurring in the summer of '63. And there's so much going on that summer. The main narrative I have going on is, of course, the March on Washington. So perhaps for force of narrative choices, I ended up short shrifting the story of Cambridge a little bit. But it's one where John Lewis, as the new chairman of SNCC, gets quite involved in trying to negotiate a settlement. And it's where he first really gets to know Robert F. Kennedy as well. I do know he had a lot of respect. He always spoke with sort of immense reverence almost toward Gloria Richardson. And, you raised the question of gender dynamics. There's not much in the record of John Lewis contemporaneously speaking out about the sexism in the movement or SNCC, but he is very much on record in later years acknowledging it, regretting it. And there's also very little evidence of him being kind of one of the maybe more swaggering men who felt, women needed to stay in their place. And whatever, we all remember Stokely Carmichael's infamous comment, although there are those who insist he was just joking on that score. The FBI surveillance of Lewis, it's interesting. Most of what I saw in the FBI files was actually Lewis quite willingly cooperating with the FBI, feeling that they were, if not entirely on the side of the movement, that it was in pursuit of cracking down on violators of federal law. And, starting, as early as, I think it's the summer of 1962, he gets a visit at his door in Troy, Alabama, from FBI agents who seem very genuinely interested in investigating a case where John Lewis and a white coworker are denied service up in Cairo, Illinois, technically a northern town, but a very southern one that was closer to Mississippi than it was to Chicago, and where Lewis spent a lot of the summer trying to desegregate that technically northern city. So the FBI, of course, plays this very interesting role in these years where they are going after the Klan and white supremacists, but they're also surveilling the movement. I think they probably figured out pretty fast that Lewis was not, one of the radicals they were most worried about. He initially had that reputation, but he soon became sort of seen as a more sort of trusted or reliable figure. And then finally, I think on your question about companionship late in life, it doesn't appear that there was anyone who, was a girlfriend, a companion in that sense. I don't think there was. And in some ways, some people on the staff felt that, he was a bit adrift without Lillian. It was an odd relationship because, he traveled all the time. He was not with her that much. So it wasn't from the unromantic marriage proposal to later on. It wasn't a conventionally kind of, romantic relationship, but she does seem to have been irreplaceable in his life. One very moving moment was at her death. He insisted on having her casket at home with him and their son, John Miles, the night before the funeral. And he kind of stayed up all night talking to it and kind of communing with her. So it suggests a very deep bond, even if it wasn't the kind of moony-eyed romantic relationship that we sometimes imagine or wish our public figures to have. He had other people who were very close to him, staff members. His chief of staff, Michael Collins, probably became the person in the world closest to him, who looked after him as he was dying and got him to his doctor's appointments. So he had other people who cared deeply for him, but there was never another Lillian. Anyway, I'll stop there with the questions. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, David. Our second discussant this afternoon is Brett V. Gadsden, an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. He specializes in 20th century American and African American history. His first book is titled Between North and South, Delaware Desegregation and the Myth of American Sectionalism, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2013. And he's currently working on a second book, From Protest to Politics, The Making of a Second Black Cabinet. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Urban History and the Journal of African American History. Brett, welcome to the seminar.
Oh, thank you, Eric. And thanks, David, for this great book. This is not the first time we've had a conversation about this project. And so when I kind of was invited to participate, I thought, oh my goodness, are we going to have anything left to talk about? But one of the things that I was most impressed by reading through the book, I think similarly to Tracy, was just the depth of the research and the ways in which you're able to uncover new aspects of Lewis's life and of the kind of social movement world during that period, in what is a period that has already garnered a great deal of attention. So thank you. That was I think, a great contribution. One of the things that John Lewis's life also did for me was, I think, trigger a lot of personal memories about John Lewis. I was fortunate enough to live in his district for some period of time when I lived in Atlanta. I had a number of, I didn't know him well, but I had a number of very, at least to me, meaningful interactions. I mean, I was there in the First Baptist Church in Montgomery when, the kind of apology heard around the world where Police Chief Kevin Murphy admitted his department's failure to protect the Freedom Riders. And then, and what I learned was a very kind of important moment in the kind of culture of police officers gave then Representative Lewis his badge as a kind of mark of respect that he had for him. And it was it was just this really, really moving moment and a moving weekend. And everyone in the church was moved to tears. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And it was kind of one of a number of interactions that I had with Lewis. I remember seeing him at a kind of freedom of speech, a kind of lawyer event. He gave a presentation, and in this kind of room full of VIPs, prominent attorneys from around the city and politicians and stuff like that, I remember witnessing kind of him move across the floor and share a brief moment with a waiter. And, for what seemed to be an eternity, the two of them talked, and it was as if they'd known each other their whole lives. And at the end of their conversation, they just hugged like they were like relatives, like they had this kind of deep, abiding relationship. And then I remember I'll just share with you this moment. I was passing through security in Atlanta, Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. And, in front of me was John Lewis. And I was a little bit late for my plane and just trying to rush through. And my anxieties were only exacerbated because basically all work, the TSA agents stopped working. And around them, they came to address Representative Lewis. and to a person. They all shared a moment and a hug. And it was just this, I mean, it was just magical to see him kind of operate in the world. And I've never been so impressed by a public figure who, you know, who's able to kind of sustain this sense of genuine kind of interest and wonder and empathy and connection with people on what seemed to be just on a kind of constant basis. I mean, it was really, really kind of striking. But as I worked my way through the book, one of the things, David, I want to kind of applaud you for is what I see as a great feat of this book is your ability to kind of historicize a beloved figure without falling prey to hagiography, right? That there is certainly a kind of great man quality about this narrative. But this is not the failing of you as the biographer, right? As kind of falling under the spell of your subject. But I think it's more of a function of Lewis and the way in which, as a civil rights activist, as a public servant, he made his way through the world and touched people kind of in all these kind of myriad ways, and that turned out to be really, really kind of interesting and moving. But I think, David, also what you managed to do is you render, and this is a way in which you kind of skirt a hagiography, is that you render Lewis as complex, right? He's not simply this guy who, by kind of sheer force of his moral bearings, right, kind of changes the world. But you render him as this sophisticated, worldly, calculating figure, right, who's operating in these, in a really, really complicated context with all these kind of cross-cutting currents and reorganizing kind of factions and stuff like that. And, Lewis doesn't always win. Sometimes he comes out, at a loss, but he never seems to, I mean, he kind of emerges at the end of these processes kind of unscathed with his humanity intact. Right. And that's kind of very different than I think a lot of the ways in which other figures during his contemporaries kind of suffered. I mean, to Tracy's point about the kind of rigors of activism during that period, it's not that Lewis didn't seem to kind of have his moments, but especially reputationally, he kind of comes out on the backside, right? In a way that seems to, like he had kind of transcended it all. And then he just kind of gets welcomed into this new professional context in a way that's, where is his reputation intact. I think the book also, I think, and this is I think one of the great things about the book as biography is that, David, you render John Lewis as a kind of end and a means to an end, right? Here is this kind of complex figure, an important figure, a man who I think that we need to kind of know more about. And you do, I think, through the kind of sheer force of your research, kind of provide new insights into his life. But I think what struck me is the extent to which Lewis, across his activist life or period of his life, and then in this kind of next act, in the second act, as a kind of public servant, is at the center of it all, it seems, right? And I think through Lewis, I think we can understand something really interesting about the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement era, about a movement that I like to consider the kind of a modern American or modern African-American political history, right? He's this great kind of vessel to explore the kind of evolving challenges that Black communities and their representatives faced. I just want to kind of then turn my attention to, and then I'll cede the floor to you, is just a couple things about Lewis's life and his journey and his career that struck me as particularly striking. And I guess one of the ways in which I think Lewis shines, at least to me, is in the ways in which, I mean, he's certainly at the center, right, of a kind of long history of struggle, of race work. in which African Americans are confronting kind of iterations of institutional white supremacy and it's all of its varied forms. But I think that there's also this kind of really fascinating way in which we see Lewis and his compatriots as kind of smart and knowing people, right? Who are, again, it's not right that wins change across his life, but it's the kind of sheer it's a function of like Lewis's brilliant calculations, his sophisticated understanding of the social movement world, of American politics in general. I think that explains his successes and his prominence. But I also think in a world, or especially in kind of this vast literature, we're often thinking about African Americans versus these various structures of white supremacy. We see, I think, in Lewis's life and in your work, David, all these fascinating intra-racial dynamics, right, that I think are deserving of a lot more attention, right? Of course, there are these great debates within SNCC and struggles within SNCC, but there's this fascinating tension between SNCC and SCLC, between Lewis and Carmichael. But I think also once he kind of enters into the realm of politics, we see this really kind of rough and tumble world, right? Where African-American political figures are trying to advance competing agendas. They're vying for positions of authority, for elected positions. We see relationships develop and then fray, right? I mean, I think this is I think these are, and especially in a place like Atlanta, the idea of this kind of uniform, kind of coherent Black community is something that I think needs to be problematized a lot. There are all these kind of fascinating and terribly interesting and important kind of fissures and points of conflict. And Lewis is at the center of all these kinds of things. And I think finally, I'll just kind of wrap up here and I want to ask you some questions. One of the things I wrote in my notes, I said Lewis as a straddler, that he's this kind of liminal figure in a way, right? Between civil rights, a history of kind of civil rights activism, but also public service, right? So there's this kind of protest and politics kind of element of his broad career. But there's also something, I think, David, that I want to kind of tease out or ask you to kind of elaborate on a little bit. And that it's the tension between politics and public policy, right? It seems to me like that especially when Lewis pivots into action and to, but he's kind of interested in kind of politics and how to kind of implement programs and stuff like that. Or I mean public policy. But for so much of his career, he seems to be engaged in this thing that's called politics. I know it's a kind of false dichotomy, but I wonder if there's an opportunity to kind of flesh that out a little bit. And then there's also, I think, this matter of interracialism that is kind of constitutive, I think, to Lewis's vision, his political vision. And it was certainly manifest, I think, in his commitment to desegregation and integration. But there's this kind of really interesting tension, and this will be kind of the second thing I hope we can talk about, is like, don't think that anybody questions the extent to which Lewis was a kind of authentic, and I use that in quotes, African-American leader. But there was this really interesting way that you tease out, or at least in my reading of the text, the extent to which that Lewis's at least power in Atlanta, especially when it rests on this foundation of white and Black support. Sometimes more white, it seems, than Black support. And I think that that's a really interesting kind of dynamic, right? Because it doesn't seem to have a kind of corrosive effect or to kind of dull his kind of principled commitments. But I think it's something that I think we might tease out a little bit more. And I think, too, with this idea of interracialism that kind of came to my mind was the extent to which John Lewis just existed in this place that was so proximate to centers of white institutional power, right? And the ways in which he was able to become like a kind of trusted confidant of a succession of speakers of the House, of Democratic speakers of the House, right? To a success, and to the Clintons in particular. I think that's a really, really kind of fascinating matter. And it struck me especially, and I'll close here, because Lewis was able to kind of maintain his connections and these links and what seemed to be these kind of productive working relationships across a period. I think we can start with the Reagan years, and push our way forward. At the same time that many of the kind of goals that he strove so hard to achieve, in his work in the movement, were gradually being eroded away by not just Republicans but also Democrats, right? By not just Republican administrations, but also Democratic administrations. So there seems this was really kind of fascinating tension, I think, there in that was kind of embedded in like his career. And so when he passes at the end of your narrative, right? It's this kind of, and this is kind of after 4 years of Trump, it's like he's this beloved figure, right? He's, I think, the closest to a kind of American saint as we probably have in this current moment. But he's at a moment where, there seems to be this kind of broad-based, bipartisan, if not backlash, kind of systemic neglect, right, of many of the principles that were so dear to him and public policies that were so dear to him in thinking about his broad configuration of social justice. So I'll just kind of leave it there, David, and kind of I'd like to hear what you have to say. I know it's a lot, but you triggered like all these questions in my mind as I was reading through the great book.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you, Brett. And yeah, a lot there. I appreciate the attention to these details and to sort of the historical context and historiographical context of a lot of these questions. Since I want to leave time for questions, I'll try to confine myself to about 10 minutes here. So I may not get to all of them. I mean, sort of to start, and this also kind of picks up on some of Tracy's comments about, his romantic life and his health issues. I had initially really thought it felt daunting to take this book on. And I thought, I'm just going to write about the public man. I'm not going to get into the private John Lewis, his personal life, any of that. But it wasn't long before I started working on it that I discovered they couldn't be that easily separated. I mean, one could do it, but I think you would get a kind of cardboard or two-dimensional account. And, the more I saw just, some of these inner qualities, I mean, the family he came from, the way he was kind of walled off from these romantic pursuits when he was married to the movement, the role of Lillian, all these things are so important to understanding his public life. I couldn't separate them. And I especially came to appreciate hearing all these kinds of stories. So you talked about, you're watching him with this waiter or the TSA people. I heard so many stories like this. One of his chiefs of staff said they'd be going off to a meeting with the Speaker of the House and were late. But the security guy at the Cannon building, wants to ask Mr. Lewis a question, and he stops, and the chief of staff is tugging at his sleeve, and John Lewis says, now Rob, the speaker can wait. The speaker can wait. And that he did, and again, it is related to his beliefs about seeing this humanity in everyone, this universalism, that the security guard was as important to him, maybe more important in that moment than the speaker. You also on a couple occasions used the word calculating, and you used it as I would, in a good way, that people, I think today especially, we have a lot of easy disdain for politics, and we can all think of examples of politicians who, seeking their own advancement or preservation of power, are calculating in ways we may not admire. But being calculating, being pragmatic, being strategic are the skills one needs to succeed in politics. And again, a lesson from Bayard Rustin. Rustin said in 1964, advocating to the MFDP group, perhaps wrongly, that they should accept the compromise, this kind of meager compromise that Lyndon Johnson was proffering them of just two seats as part of the Mississippi delegation. Rustin said, when you enter politics, you've entered the realm of compromise. So, if you've come here to play politics, now maybe it's not the right compromise to take, but I think Lewis came to appreciate that sort of only being a voice to uphold principle would only get you so far. And in his years on the Atlanta City Council, he kind of took that path. And he railed against the corruption, and there was a lot of corruption on the city council. But as a result, he didn't get put on any important committees, and he wound up not being all that effective as a municipal legislator. And I think he sort of learned from that experience in Atlanta to conduct himself a bit differently when he got to the United States Congress. Again, I don't think I could point to any instance where I would say John Lewis sold out. But he did learn sort of to make, calculated decisions, to decide when to go with the opportunity that was before you rather than holding out for something more. Sometimes he chose to hold out. And I think when I think about sort of his kind of becoming sort of embedded in the leadership of the Democratic Party those years, I tend to see it in that framework. I mean, some people will take a more critical view. Brent Staples, in a review I would die for, this wonderfully generous review in the New York Times, said Lewis became something of an apparatchik in the Democratic Party. I wouldn't use that word. He had many moments where he stood apart, where he was alone or one of a few people to vote a certain way out of principle. But he certainly did come to see the Democratic Party as, in a deeply divided society, kind of the best available instrument for advancing the causes he believed in, whether it was protecting voting rights or, protecting, African American, job opportunities. It's true he wasn't a policy wonk. And some people would say, well, he wasn't much of a legislator. And some of his staff pushed back on that. I think what people were meant with that legislator remark is he wasn't a deep in the weeds policy guy. That, even when he goes to action in the Carter administration, which is kind of an umbrella group that houses Peace Corps and Vista, a lot of the volunteer organizations, he turns it into basically a variation on his previous job at the Voter Education Project, where he uses it to travel and to fire up the troops and visit different parts of America, visit Appalachia and the Black Belt and Native American reservations. So he figures out what his strengths are, which often are in this kind of inspirational realm, and channels his energies there. I mean, he does sometimes, on voting rights, he knew those policies and laws as well as anyone. And, Jim Sensenbrenner, the Republican who was behind the renewal of 2006, said to me, we knew the key to getting this renewal passed was making sure we had John Lewis on board, and that would be the key. And he kind of learned to legislatively trade on his, heroism, his moral aura. And people told me sometimes, in Congress, when you're voting, you're allowed to sit out the first round and kind of see how other people vote. He was one of the people you might wait and see, how is John Lewis voting on this bill before I cast my vote. He had that kind of credibility. And if you got him to sponsor a bill or his name attached, you got him behind it, that would help get it passed, even if he wasn't the guy, really doing the horse trading behind the scenes. So it was, in that sense, more politics than policy. But in a broad sense, he devoted those political skills to advancing the policies that he really believed in. I think it's always a hard thing to say, are the gains of the civil rights movement stalling? Are they being repealed, eroded, fought? We can use different verbs, and I think it can be hard in the present moment to know exactly where the status stands if we want to compare to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. Lewis was sort of a believer in progress, maybe unfashionable these days, and a believer in hope. And so he always kind of tried to remind people of how far we'd come. But whether it was Newt Gingrich or Clarence Thomas, John Roberts, people don't remember, he crossed over to the Senate to testify against the confirmation of John Roberts as Chief Justice of the United States. Someone who a lot of Democrats actually supported because, it was a Republican pick and he had this impeccable resume and seemed relatively moderate compared to who else Bush might have nominated. But Lewis, knew the memos he had done as Justice Department official and warned that he was going to gut the Voting Rights Act, which, of course, 7 years or 8 years later in Shelby County, he did. So the protection, the preservation of the legacy of the movement was always, I think, his central focus as a legislator. And that also included things like the creation of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was something, he fought for 30 years and finally saw through to completion. I'm sure there are a lot of things you left on the table, Brett, that I haven't taken up, but I see the time, so I want to make sure some folks in the audience at least can get some questions in too.
And thank you both. So we have a number of hands up. I am going to ask Dan Letwin to unmute himself, and then Steve Brady, you're on standby.
Thanks. Having gotten 3/4 the way through your biography, I've been enjoying it and this session very, very much. John Lewis always seemed so vastly admirable. Even in the pantheon of civil rights leaders, he just stands out for his courage, his humility, steadfastness, his integrity, his down-to-earth eloquence. And there's little in your biography I find to disturb those characterizations. Yes, he became a politician, and there were, of course, compromises along the way. But again, within the universe of politicians, he's always come across as exceptionally principled, the conscience of the Senate, of the Congress. And there's little I see here to alter that picture. But in the spirit of seeking out tensions and paradoxes, my question concerns how Lewis negotiated the cross currents of Democratic Party politics during the post-civil rights movement period as he pursues his political career. And I'm particularly intrigued by his embrace of, or at least his flirtation with, the centrist thrust of the Carter, Clinton sort of DLC style post-liberal agenda. How did that, you think, for Lewis, align with either with the kind of progressive, for lack of a better word, style of 60s civil rights politics that he came out of, kind of embodied in the late years of Martin Luther King's politics, or with his position as a fixture of progressive style politics during the peak of his stature in Congress? Would he have perceived or recognized a tension between these two traditions, you might say between a kind of a social democratic, Great Society type liberal tradition and a neoliberal tradition? Or is that just a tension of my own construction?
Well, I think in some ways these are categories we have kind of retrospectively imposed on some of these years, and kind of overlooks, just how progressive in the way that word used to be used. Progressive now I often say progressive used to be a euphemism for liberal, and now it's a euphemism for radical or, even Marxist. Like a progressive in those, I mean, it was Bill Clinton who had the Progressive Policy Institute. People started using the word because liberal had kind of gotten discredited. Look, there were some ways in which he works with the DLC. He does embrace and support politicians who I would say are to his right because he's interested in making the Democratic Party nationally viable. In 1988, his desired candidate, who doesn't end up running, is Sam Nunn, who's definitely to the right. I mean, Bill Clinton, we can argue about. Bill Clinton, I think Lewis believes is a genuine progressive on race. And Bill Clinton, for example, told me in an interview, it was through conversations with John Lewis that Clinton really became aware of the extent of the problem of, what we now call environmental racism or environmental justice, where they had tried to pass in Congress but couldn't pass a bill to sort of clean up toxic waste dumps that were primarily in Black neighborhoods. And after consulting with Lewis, Clinton does this by executive order. There's a lot of that kind of thing going on that I think, historians have sort of neglected. And in the scheme of things, when you're coming after the presidency of George Bush Sr., who kind of has gotten a warm and fuzzy makeover, but was the first president since Andrew Johnson to veto a civil rights bill. And John Lewis is partly the reason why he signs it the next time around, because Lewis goes to the White House and jawbones him and says, don't you keep demagoguing this as a quota bill. It's not a quota bill. It's it's a job fairness bill, and eventually Bush capitulates and signs. So I do think Lewis is demonstrating both a kind of pragmatism in thinking we've got to make this Democratic Party viable again. He himself, as Brett says, has won his district and has support in Atlanta from a broad interracial coalition that spans from Black to white, from moderate to left. And I think he sees that as the kind of winning formula for the Democratic Party nationally. The last comment I'll make on this is there's a real difference between, I think, some, at least, Southern Black representatives. Mike Espy is another, someone I talked to, Sanford Bishop, and Northern African American representatives, the latter of whom often represent, whether in Detroit or New York or Philadelphia, neighborhoods that are almost exclusively African American. And there's not really a conflict. I mean, they're, of course, representatives of all their constituents, but in having, a kind of Black politics, where Lewis wanted to do both at the same time. He wanted to be a genuine and true and a representative of his Black constituents, while also being a faithful representative of his white supporters too. And he was very cognizant of that and felt that that was also what the Democratic Party had to do.
Thank you. Steve Brady, please unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks very much. So I will definitely be reading this book. It sounds fantastic. So two really quick questions. As somebody who's writing a biography myself right now, as a biographer, when you're writing on somebody who is so important a leader in what's clearly the most or one of the most important moral issues of the day, how do you avoid hagiography? How do you avoid being tempted in that direction? And my second question is to keep it on a kind of religious basis here. Lewis's early education, his college education was so deeply religious. What would you say was the impact of this on his decision to go into civil rights activism?
Well, I guess I'll start with the first question. A couple people have raised this. when I was first starting the book, a lot of people kind of immediately kind of liked the idea when I would mention to them. And my friend Leon Wieselt here said, well, the danger is you don't want to write the life of St. Francis, right? You don't want to write literally the life of a saint. And John Lewis is called a saint, and he was on the cover of Time magazine as long ago as 1975, I think it was, Saints Among Us. And it was actually Mother Teresa who was on the cover, but John Lewis is one of the handful of people featured inside. I guess what I tried to do is just show him, warts and all, and capture, as Tracy said, the vulnerability, as Brett said, his political side. I think it's kind of nice narratively. It doesn't immediately follow, but soon after the Saints Among Us cover, 1 or 2 chapters later, you have him going negative against Julian Bond in order to win the 1986 congressional race. So probably not what a saint would do. It is what a good politician does. So in that sense, I just tried to be, this sounds maybe ingenuous, but tried to be faithful to the record, faithful to the evidence before me. And I found that John Lewis behaved more like a human being than a saint, albeit an incredibly saintly, admirable human being who certainly has some qualities that I and most of us could never hope to approximate, especially that courage and equanimity in the face of death. As for his religion, unquestionably, it was a formative motivator, leading him to the movement. In Nashville at American Baptist Theological Seminary, he quickly realizes he's not that interested in Christianity per se. He's not interested, like a lot of his classmates, in going back home, getting a congregation, and saving souls, as he puts it. He's interested in the social gospel. He's interested, some of his professors are people like Kelly Miller Smith, the leading sort of progressive Black minister in Nashville, who's heads the local NAACP, starts the Nashville Christian Leadership Council, an offshoot of the SCLC. So these are the people he gravitates to and falls in with. And they nurture this kind of fusion of Christian teaching, yes, but also Gandhian nonviolence and a kind of social gospel orientation that leads Lewis on the path that he then sticks to for so long.
Thank you. So I've got a question that I would like to have you explore. As a politician, as a congressman, John Lewis spends much of his time, the bulk of his time, on domestic policy issues that are of deep concern to him, voting rights first and foremost, but others. But Congresspeople also deal with issues of national security and foreign affairs. And I'm hoping you could talk about his orientation toward those two things. You write about his support of the state of Israel. He comes into office at the twilight of the Cold War. The war in Central America is still raging. There's the first Gulf War. He opposes the Patriot Act, you point out. He supports the authorization of force against Afghanistan. How would you characterize his foreign policy orientation?
Right. It's a good question. And, I think he was somewhat, I don't know if I want to say less interested. That's too kind of thin a way of putting it. But, it didn't command his interest and attention the way certainly an issue like voting rights did. But, he was very engaged with the world. And, from the time as a 24-year-old, he took a 3-month trip with his good friend Don Harris around Africa, and is there for the independence of Zambia in 1964. He's coming to recognize the importance of the world to America and the importance of America to the world. His basic orientation, is rooted in his pacifism and his nonviolence. And so he hates war, and he's often outspoken against wars, opposes both Iraq war interventions. But he also comes to, I think, develop what I would call a more sophisticated or nuanced view of things. I see this as early as the Somalia famine, where he comes to support American troops being sent over to try to help feed Africans in that crisis. We see it again with the Kosovo intervention. At first, he's kind of instinctively opposed to support the bombing campaign, but he comes round, and his staff aide, who he turned to, she told me, he said to me, Debbie, I want to know, the right thing to do, not the politically right thing to do. What's the right thing to do? Because he saw there was a moral case to be made in both directions. He then became very passionate about the Darfur genocide. And I think, people today kind of with the question of Israel see it in different ways, of course. But, he saw a fundamentally imperiled nation whose survival and security was partly an American responsibility. So I think there was a consistency that when he sort of deviated from a more pacifist approach, it was still in the name of a kind of greater humanity. It was in the name of saving lives, preserving and promoting peace. I don't know if we have a name for such a foreign policy philosophy, but that's probably how I would try to categorize him.
Thank you. Elizabeth Shermer has a number of questions, but I'm going to pose her second one here. She would like to know about David Greenberg and what you think about the role of the media in shaping the image of Lewis, both before and after he got into electoral politics, in part because you are one of our foremost experts on media and politics.
Well, thank you for that question. When I started this book, I thought, after having done Nixon's Shadow, a book about Nixon's image, and Republic of Spin, about the White House spin machine, I was getting away from all that. I mean, after all, he was the authentic John Lewis who, was sort of free from such media concerns. Well, I found out that that was not the case. As early as the 1970s, I found memos from Julian Bond to John Lewis when he was running the voter education project, full of public relations advice, telling him you've got to get out there, toot your own horn. And every city you go to, there's going to be a Black local public affairs channel, and you got to get on that show and talk. And, into his congressional years, he becomes very conscious and mindful of media presentation. I don't say that as a condemnation, as if you've read Republic of Spin, that's part of what being a good politician is knowing how to work the media. And I also don't think that there's a contradiction between contrivance and authenticity. So in other words, he worked this image. They were very deliberate about which shows to go on and with whom and what messages to put across. When he decides in 2008 finally to transfer his endorsement from Hillary Clinton to Barack Obama, all kinds of strategizing that I lay out goes into it. And finally, it's going to be one interview with Andrea Mitchell at the national level and one with a favorite local reporter in Atlanta. But, the fact that they are promoting John Lewis and trying to give him his best image is part of what you do as a good politician in order to succeed. So I think the John Lewis luster is deserved, but he was not unaware of the ministrations that went into it.
Thank you. I am afraid that our time is now up, and I have to draw this session to a close. So let me end by simply thanking David, Tracy, and Brett and Sarah for this discussion this afternoon. And Sarah, over to you for final words.
Well, my thanks as well to everyone for a really fantastic conversation. And thanks too to those who are in our audience. Just another reminder that the next session will take place in 1 week on Monday, November 4th at 4 p.m. when the Washington History Seminar features James Graham Wilson's America's Cold Warrior, Paul Nietzsche, and National Security from Roosevelt to Reagan. Please join us then. Until then, our thanks. Good night, everyone.